Hello, everyone. Before starting this video on the chip war, the semiconductor war, or the technology war between the US and China, let me first explain to you as to why is it relevant for your political science mains examination for 2025 and maybe for 2026. What you find is that you have GS paper 2 in relation to international relations, which has a huge overlap with political science paper 2 in relation to international politics and India and the world. There's a trend in UPSC in which what happens is that there are current affair topics, which is asked in GS paper 2 in international relations. And few years later, that same topic is again repeated and asked within the political science examination in paper 2. I'll give you an example for this. In 2017-18, the trade war between the US and China was in the news. And in 2018 itself, you would find the question within GS paper 2 in international relations on the trade war between US and China in relation to the World Trade Organization. Few years later in 2020, you would have the same question repeated within political science. There's another example. The Prime Minister Modi, he made the visit to Israel in 2017. This was the first visit by Indian Prime Minister to Israel. And during this visit, India officially launched what is known as the dehyphenation policy. 1 year later, you would find this question on India-Israel in relation to the dehyphenation policy within the GS examination. And in 2021, that same question in relation to dehyphenation policy and Israel would be asked in political science paper 2. Same thing happened with I2U2. I2U2 was formed in 2021, which is also known as the West Asia Forum. It has Israel, India, UAE, and the United States. Within GS, this question was asked in 2022. 1 year later, in 2023, the West Asia Quad or I2U2 was asked in political science examination. There have been times also whereby the same current affairs topic is asked both in PSIR and in GS in the same year. So within 2021, you had a question on India-Africa relationship asked in GS paper 2 and also asked in political science examination paper 2. In the same year, 2021, you had a question on Quad being asked in GS paper 2. And in the same year, you had a question asked on Quad within the political science examination. In 2019 also, the same pattern was repeated, where you had a question on the conflict between USA and Iran in relation to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action being asked in GS paper and also in the political science paper in paper 2. Now, what has happened this year is that in 2024 mains, within the GS examination, GS paper 2, UPSC had asked a question on the global supply chain or decoupling in relation to US-China relationship and its impact on India. This year, it was not asked in PSIR. So the semiconductor war, the chip war, decoupling, these related topics still becomes extremely significant for your political science examination for 2025. And if it's not asked in 2025, then for 2026. This video would help you in understanding it for your political science examination. Any doubts on this? No doubts? All right. So then we'll move to the next topic, which is, well, basically current affairs. I've actually it's already been done as part of the QIP classes in terms of the semiconductor wars, or what is known as the technology war, the tech wars, the chip war. It can come in any of these terms. So if it doesn't come in this year's mains examination, it still becomes very significant for your mains examination next year. Or what they can do is maybe ask this in GS this year, and it may come in PSIR next year. We'll wait and see. The exam is tomorrow. Starting from tomorrow. So we'll wait and see on how it does. If it has been asked, then you don't worry about this. Any doubts? All right, write down. US-China, US-China, technology war, US-China technology war, US-China technology war, or semiconductor war, or chip war? US-China, semiconductor war, or chip war, or technology war, or technology war, technology war. So when we're talking about the US-China technology war, so first thing is, what are the steps that have been taken by the United States? So you write one small paragraph and make you write in much more words. But in your UPSC exam, you write in shorter words. And similarly, what are the steps that have been taken by the Chinese? And then we'll analyze it through theory. Right? And the final paragraph would be in relation to India. And then there would be a conclusion. Conclusion in terms of a way forward. Why? Because it's current affairs. So current affair questions generally have to have a way forward. Theory questions would have a summary. All right, write down. Steps taken by the US. Steps taken by US. Steps taken by the United States. Or the...
Sir,
Yes, Prerna?
so this is this we have to write on the US-China.
Technology, chip war, or semiconductor war.
Okay.
So under this, write down first, what are the steps that have been taken by the US in terms of this? Write down the first one. The US has enacted export controls. The US has enacted export controls. The US has enacted export controls in 2022. In 2022. In 2022. Over semiconductors. Over semiconductors. Over semiconductors. Over semiconductors. In 2023, same paragraph. In 2023, the US regulated investment by US companies, investment by US companies in Chinese semiconductor industries, in Chinese semiconductor industries, in Chinese semiconductor industries as a state of emergency, 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 state of emergency. So this is what Biden did. He basically told the US semiconductor industries, more importantly, the individual Americans that were working in the semiconductor industry within China. And he gave them, I think, a 3 months notice, and he told them, you leave China. And he has asked all the American companies to decouple from China in the semiconductor industry. Why? It has to do with that semiconductors are a strategic industry. US is losing its hegemony. Hegemony is not only in terms of military power, economic power. Hegemony comes from technology itself also. To build advanced weaponry, whether it is missile systems, anti-ballistic missile systems, stealth aircrafts, or the new 6th generation aircrafts, you need semiconductors. And this is where the Americans are losing out in terms of the Chinese. Even if you look at 5G, there's only one company that is able to build affordable 5G towers that actually provides actual 5G. In India, what we have is just 4G plus. That is Huawei. So the Chinese have really taken a very strong lead in all of these, especially in strategic industry, particularly semiconductors. And the fear in the US is that it is technology that goes into making their weapons, goes into ensuring their hard power in terms of military, in terms of economy, which they're going to lose. And if they lose this particular tech industry, over time, they're going to use the hard power that comes from controlling technology. So it is an aspect of the US intending to control the hegemony that it has. Any doubts on this? Write down. Further, the United States seeks to control the exports, seeks to control the exports of semiconductors in an effort to cripple the AI industry or artificial intelligence industry within China. The next big thing, AI, machine learning, other aspects, they require stronger, faster semiconductors. They require stronger, faster chips. And if you don't control the chips, then you don't control the next part of the technology, which is the use of those chips for artificial intelligence, the use of those chips for machine learning, the use of those chips for other advanced technologies. And therefore, you're going to completely lose out in technology, which is then going to negatively impact your hard power, and therefore the American hegemony. So you control the basic thing, which is semiconductors. And what this would do is that then the Chinese cannot advance within artificial intelligence. They cannot advance in machine learning. They cannot advance in IoT, Internet of Things. They cannot advance in multiple other things, including quantum computing. And therefore, the Americans get to maintain their lead in technology and therefore ensure their hard power. Yes, Mohit?
So basically, the US is restricting both access as well as indigenous development by the Chinese of semiconductors.
So access to directly is being restricted and regulated. As far as indigenous development is also concerned, so that is done much more through stealth. So it is not only about how do you stop a Chinese company from advancing within, let's say, AI and other things. You steal their secrets. You ensure that the main people that are working there, it is known as talent poaching, which both the Americans and the Chinese are doing. If you look at why does, I'll give you an example. Turkey right now has the most advanced drones. Why? Why has they gotten so good at making drones that they exported to Azerbaijan, they have exported to Pakistan, the Chinese are working with them, even the Americans are buying drones from them. Why is that? It was just one person, actually. He graduated from MIT, but he was a Turkish in origin. He did not get the visa to stay within the US. So he went back to Turkey. Turkey created an ecosystem for him to actually build the complete drone ecosystem. Now the Americans want him. And this is a form of talent poaching. The Chinese are also indulging in this, whereby they're trying to poach the talent that are working in semiconductor industry, especially those of Chinese origin, and same thing that the Americans are doing. And this is one way where you can then cripple the indigenous industries that other countries are trying to build. This is what is talked about India also. India has one of the largest leads in terms of IT services. But why can't we create Google and other things? Because people who are capable of doing this in terms of technology or understanding, they migrate to the US, where there is more opportunity, there's a better ecosystem and more money. And that is a huge problem that India has in creating those kind of industries, whether it is data sciences or other fields. So talent poaching in itself is a huge deal between both the US and the Chinese. I'll make you right. That is one thing that the Chinese are also. When we talk about the steps by the US, one of the steps by the Chinese is to poach. They have a lot of money. They can pay well. If you look at just the one university, Peking University, the complete budget is more than $1 billion. If you combine all the IITs in India, it is more than the budget for that one single university itself. It is more than all the IITs in India combined. So they have money. Money is not an issue for them. It's just about the fact that you poach talent in those. Is it clear, Mohit?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Write down. The next point. The US has ensured that its allies, the US has ensured that its allies, the US has also ensured that its allies also undertake export controls, also undertake export controls. The US, in the same paragraph, the US, Japan, and Netherlands. The US, Japan, and Netherlands provide roughly 90%, provide roughly 90% of the equipments used to manufacture semiconductors. Japan, Netherlands, Taiwan have imposed export controls of such equipments, Japan, Netherlands, and Taiwan, of such equipments to China, Right on. Semiconductors, same paragraph, semiconductors are a dual-use technology. Meaning they can be used both for military and civilian purposes. Semiconductors are a dual use technology, meaning both can be used for military and civilian purposes. And the US allies have imposed restrictions through the Wisner arrangement. WASSENAAR. WASSENAAR. Wisner arrangement. So Wisner arrangement basically restricts dual-use technology. India became a member of this a little while back. When I say little while back, it's been around 5-6 years. It allows for the export of dual-use technology to a country. They're basically using allies, particularly Japan and Netherlands. They're using the Wisner arrangement to stop the export of semiconductors to China. One of the things is, let's say you export those semiconductors or semiconductor equipments to Iran or Russia. Would it make its way to China? So this is one of the things that the Americans are also doing. The Americans have also put restrictions on what are considered Chinese allies, that you cannot export these equipments also to the Chinese allies. It is not about just exporting semiconductors. They have technology that is used to make semiconductor. I think there is, forgetting the name, I think it's deep purple lithography. It's important for prelims, just in case. It's something that Netherlands has. I think deep purple lithography, something like this. It allows to make semiconductors. All of you know what a lathe machine is? engineers would. Right? It is used to manufacture certain, what would I say, tools and basic tools. In the same way, lithography and all of these are equipments that are used to manufacture semiconductors. So you may have the know-how, but you may not have the equipments to actually manufacture it in the first place. Like when we talk about nuclear weapons require enriched uranium, which is a very difficult technique that a country can have. One of the things when we talk about Iran through the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the restrictions that have been put on Iran is to ensure that Iran is not able to make enriched uranium, which can be used in nuclear weapons. So you need the technology to make technology. So you restrict both of them. You restrict the semiconductors also, and you restrict the ability to make semiconductors also to the Chinese. Any doubts on this? All right, write down. That you can put, but you're trying to put a lot of things into that argument. But you can put it. That's deterrence by denial also. It would fit into the definition. Write down. Separate point. The US and its allies, including India. Oh, the US and its ally and India, not including India. The US and its allies and India were not a ally. The US and its allies and India have also put restrictions, on Huawei, Huawei, on Huawei. It is an aspect of decoupling. It is an aspect of decoupling. It is an aspect of decoupling. Now,
So,
Huawei has one of the best affordable technology for 5G towers especially. India also put restrictions on buying 5G towers from Huawei. Why? Security risks. Same thing has been said by the Americans, same thing has been said by some of its allies. Not all of them, like Japan has said this, but some European countries are continuing to buy Huawei towers. This has created a lot of problems for the Americans because the world in itself is still continuing to buy Huawei 5G towers. Why? Affordable, best technology at the cheapest rate. So decoupling in terms of Huawei has not been very successful for the Americans. So all of these restrictions, what you can do is obviously deterrence by denial, but it only stops to an extent. You can delay the ability of the Chinese to gain parity with the Americans by 10 years, 15 years, but not for a very long time. And this is a problem that the Americans are also facing. Why? Because Global South, third world countries, and some European countries also, which are allies of the US, are still buying from Huawei. India would have also continued to buy if we did not have the border problem with the Chinese also. Any doubts? Write down. However, in the same paragraph, several European and Global South countries, several European and Global South countries, several Europeans and Global South countries are continuing to purchase Huawei 5G towers, Huawei 5G towers, Huawei 5G towers, Huawei 5G towers. It exposes the limit. It exposes the limit. It exposes the limit of American influence. Exposes the limit of American influence. American influence. American influence. American influence. Any doubts on this? Right now, separate point. The G7 and European Union, the G7 and European Union have introduced, the G7 and European Union have introduced the idea of de-risking, or diversification from Chinese semiconductor industry, It is for economic security. 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 An aspect of this is the emergence of China plus one. An aspect of this is the emergence of China plus one model. China plus one model. China one plus one model. So this has been said by the Europeans. Europeans don't want to take a very strong stand against the Chinese, because decoupling basically means that you're trying to break the complete link from China. De-risking therefore seems much more of a subtle way of saying the same thing. So, and they have gone much more for China plus one model, meaning we want to ensure economic security. We'll continue to buy from the Chinese, but not be completely dependent upon the Chinese on this. So they have gone for de-risking and diversification. Write down an example for this. Samsung has closed its Chinese mobile factory. Samsung has closed its Chinese mobile factory and shifted to Vietnam, Similarly, Dell, you understand now, the laptop making company. Dell plans to cease, C-E-A-S-E, cease purchase of Chinese semiconductors, Further, the US has restricted export of advanced chips or semiconductor chips, to Chinese allies, in particular in Middle East, So there's one company, you just write it down in the brackets, which has done this. NVIDA. So actually nobody knew about this, that the Americans have said this. So this company, Nadia, however it is pronounced, they basically released a press statement that the US has asked us for these restrictions to the Middle East only, as of now. Which Middle East country, they've also not mentioned. So the presumption is most likely to be Iran or some of the Chinese allied countries. That what would happen is you give these advanced chips to those countries, they would then send it to the Chinese, who would then reverse engineer it and then gain parity with the Americans. So what they're doing is not just restricting the Chinese, but also Chinese allies. Doubts on this? No doubts? So these are all the steps that have been taken by the US. In your GS, you just write down the bullet points. Make sure that you write down the keywords. Like when we write export controls, mention Netherlands and Japan. Mention the Weisner arrangement. Decoupling, give the example of Huawei, China plus one. Make sure that the keywords are there. Any doubts on this?
Sir, I have.
Yes.
So what is the Weisner arrangement?
So Wisner arrangement basically is to control the export of dual-use technology. Dual-use technology are those that can be used both in military weapons and in
Civilian.
civilian. And the Wisner arrangement ensures that those things cannot be exported to other countries. Like during the 90s, India wanted to purchase the cryogenic engine. It was a dual-use technology. It can be both used by Israel, but it can also be used in the Agni missile system. So we wanted to purchase it from the Russians. The American hegemony had been established by then, and then the Americans said no to the Russians. So it took us about 8-9 years just to establish the cryogenic engine by ourselves during that time. Any doubts? All right. Write down steps by China. Yes, Mohit?
So these US restrictions are on all types of semiconductors or only advanced semiconductors?
I think they have their own classification for this, but that would be far too much depth for UPSC.
Okay,
Because
so
even when we say advanced semiconductors, there are classifications for all of them. But then it becomes far too advanced for UPSC.
okay, so
All right. Write down steps by China. Steps by China. China would undertake homegrown solutions. China would undertake homegrown solutions. Homegrown solutions to overcome the restrictions on exports, to overcome the restrictions on exports, to overcome the restrictions on exports. They would decouple from the Americans. They would decouple from the Americans. They would decouple from the Americans. So you can actually write one example. It's not related to chips or semiconductors. Android, I think all of you know what it is. It's an Android. It's an operating system. So the Chinese have made their own. And all the Chinese phones, not the ones that are being exported, because in India, we still use Androids on the Chinese built phones. But in their own home built phones, they have a new operating system, which is known as Harmony. So within China, they have basically replaced Android with the Harmony operating system. So that is one example you can write in your UPSC exam. So what they're trying to do is decouple from the Americans themselves. So they basically replaced Android and they're making their own, which is the Harmony operating system for their own mobile phones that are used within China itself. And maybe tomorrow, some global South country would also allow for those exports of Harmony operating systems to their countries. But the Chinese phones that are still coming to India, Android. Any doubts? Right on the next point. China has also placed counter bans. China has also placed counter bans on American products. Counter bans on American products. Counter bans on American products and restricted mergers. Mergers in the semiconductor industry. Restricted mergers in the semiconductor industry. Semiconductor industry. Semiconductor industry. Semiconductor industry. So one of the reason that they gave for the ban was cybersecurity. So there was one company, Micron, MICRON. So that has been banned, technically banned on this. So they're losing about $3 billion because they used to earn $3 billion from the Chinese market. Now they're not earning that much. And same is happening with other companies that have been put on the counterbans. It's not much, but some countries would be hit a lot more as compared to other countries. The problem is you have never actually allowed American companies to operate within the Chinese market. So Google doesn't work there. Facebook is not there. Instagram is not there. So most of the American companies are actually not even functioning within the Chinese market because you had restricted them in the past. So you really have a very small play here, which is to decouple from the Americans and to counterban, because there are not even enough American companies that are working on this. One thing that has actually hurt the American companies or American business is mergers. So mergers allow for cheap exports and use for the cheap raw material, because China is the leader in rare earth metals, especially gallium and other things, which they've also restricted in terms of exports. But they're leaders in rare earth metals. It's not about just having rare earth metals. Let's say you've taken lithium from Bolivia or cobalt from Congo. It's not a rock that is used in a semiconductor. It has to be defined. It has to take the shape of something that can be used in a semiconductor. So what China has is within, let's say, rare earth metals, they're part of an important aspect of the global value chain, right? So one of the things, I'll make you write it as a point, is China has restricted the export of those metals also that are part of the global value chain. So just write on the examples. Micron. So Micron has been, well, banned. And you can also give the example Intel. So Intel is actually looking for a merger with a particular Chinese company, which has been put on hold. So the end date is actually 2024. So we'll have to wait and see whether Intel is able to go through that merger or not with the Chinese company. Any doubts on this? Right.
So,
Yes, Prerna?
so for unrestricted mergers in semiconductor industry, for that you gave two examples, Intel and the other one
No,
is
in Micron is for ban. Intel is for merger.
Okay.
Right on the next one.
Thank you.
China has restricted the export. China has restricted the exports of rare earth metals, restricted the export of rare earth metals, in particular, gallium and germanium, However, the US and its allies, have argued that this has had a limited impact. And they are diversifying the global value chain. They're diversifying the global value chain from the Chinese. Right on the next point. China has undertaken talent poaching, espionage, and reverse engineering. To maintain its growth in the semiconductor industry. in the semiconductor industry. Further, the Chinese have gone for import substitution. Import substitution. Import substitution. Import substitution. For equipments related to semiconductor industry. For equipments related to semiconductor industry. For equipments related to semiconductor industry. Semiconductor industry. Any doubts? So these are all the steps taken by the US, steps taken by the Chinese. In your UPSC answer, make it one paragraph. Use the keywords, one para, only primary keywords, so that you have enough space to write for theory. Any doubts on this?
Sir,
Yes, Prerna?
sir, everything has to be reproduced into one paragraph.
Yes, I'm making you write a lot more so that when you revise, you're able to link it together.
Oh,
But when you write answers, you have to reduce it to the word limit.
okay.
Because you won't have the capacity to write all of this.
Yes.
Over explanation would be done then. You expect the examiner to know certain things, you just
Yeah.
use the keywords.
Keywords.
I know a lot of you are not answer writing, but you really have to, because we've moved to the second part. So we've done with how to write introductions. Your paper 2 would be done by next week. And we'll move to how to improve the body. And then we'll move into conclusions also. So you need to make sure you write a lot of answers, because you may give the mains examination next year or the year after that. But answer writing as a skill you can learn right now. So that when you see in the previous matches also, you only open up the books of PSIR either when you're giving mains or either for a few months after the prelims examination and you know you have not qualified. But answer writing won't be done again because you won't have this time. So make sure that you write a lot of answers. Make sure that the skill you learn. And you can write at any point of time in the future. It would not be a problem because a skill is like learning a cycle. You always remember how to ride a cycle. Yes, Mohit?
Sir, regarding this diversification of the value chain for rare earth metals, so if China is producing most of the rare earth metals, so how can that be diversified?
See, the point is the technology that they're using in terms of material sciences, they've gotten very good at it, there's no doubt. But the Americans also have that knowledge, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, because they were the original ones that taught the Chinese. So the same industries, let's say the US and others, the Japanese, the Taiwanese can move this and teach it to the Vietnamese, Malaysians, Indians, others, wherever it is, shift it to. And
So
assuming you shift it to India, India also has a very strong base in material sciences. To a small extent, we do have a strong base in material sciences. So India then can also compete with the Chinese, assuming that we have the backing right now from the advanced industrial countries. Yes, Mohit?
Sir, but if all these metals are being mined in China,
No.
why would
It's not necessary. It's not that, see, they are a leader, they have a lot of these rare earth metals. But they're not the only place in the world that has this rare earth metals. So Australia also has them. Africa also has them. South America also has them. India has also found lithium within India. We have other rare earth metals, which we have actually not even looked for. So if we do establish an industry, we can look for those rare earth metals in different parts of India also. The presumption is China does have it because they control Mongolia. There's a place in Mongolia, forgetting the name, the highest deposits of rare earth metals. But you can't do, that's luck, right? That became part of their territory, is luck for them. But there are other parts of the world which also have this, and India can import from them and ensure that the same thing can be used in semiconductors.
Okay, sir.
Any other doubts? All right. So we're done with the steps by the US and the Chinese. Right on the next part, which is, well, views. Views. So which theory? Multiple would come here. Which theory? All of them, but how? Yes, how? Yes, how? What you're giving me is the name of the theory. Some you have to justify. Yeah. Yes. So that would be the core part of Thucydides trap, and it is also in relation to what is known as power transition theory. That the US wants to maintain its hegemony. It is able to maintain its hegemony of hard power, that is its economic strength and military strength, as long as it controls technology, not just semiconductors, but future technologies like AI and Internet of Things and quantum computing and other things. But all of that requires the basic semiconductors. So they want to maintain their hegemony. And Thucydides trap we'll talk about on how the Chinese are feeling suffocated by this. Because all of this export controls that the Americans are now putting on the Chinese, it is going to create a lot of what in the Chinese? Security dilemma, but what else? Frustration. That there is a power that is above me that is trying to control my growth. And it leads to a huge frustration in the rising power. So there's a famous thinker that has compared Thucydides trap and power transition. Power transition, I'll explain you later. When we talk about Thucydides trap, it is generally seen that it is the rising power that undertakes the military action against the dominant power. So when Allison brought this in relation to Sparta and Athens, Sparta was the dominant power, Athens was the rising power, and Athens undertook the war against Sparta but lost. In the same way, today, it is more likely that the Chinese would first retaliate. Why? Because they're feeling suffocated. They're feeling that they have been caged in by the Americans. That is not allowing them to grow. That is not allowing them to take their appropriate place in the world global order. So they would be the first one to try to break out of that cage. The power transition theory is the opposite. They would consider that it would be the dominant power that would undertake this action. Why? Security dilemma. They're feeling threatened by the rising power. So it is better, well, to squash the rising power when it is weak rather than wait for it to get equal to you and then undertake that conflict. What else? A part of realism. They would come in the Thucydides and realism. What is happening in terms of Thucydides is the balance of power is shifting. How is functionalism? Complex interdependence that both the Americans and the Chinese are tied together in terms of complex interdependence. Decoupling is the opposite for complex interdependence. You're trying to undo the complex interdependence by decoupling. What is? Theory. The post-colonialists would argue what? That in this great war between the Chinese and the Americans, it is the poor that is being throttled. Why? Because they buy at higher prices from the Americans because the Chinese are not allowing to, or Huawei is not being allowed to enter their own country, or they buy it from the Chinese, but then be restricted by the Americans. Like the famous saying, no? When two elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. All right, right on. John Bateman, Bateman, John Bateman. One second. Mohammed, how would it be related to HST or hegemonic stabilization theory? It is related. See, a large number of theories fit into these great power conflicts. All right. Write down. John Bateman, in US-China technological decoupling. John Bateman, in US-China technological decoupling, 2022. John Bateman, in US-China technological decoupling, 2022. Highlights that decoupling is a means to untie. Decoupling is a means to untie complex interdependence. Untie complex interdependence. Complex interdependence of US-China tech relationship. However, it is the allies of these great powers and trading partners. It is the allies of these great powers and trading partners that are caught in the crossfire. Allies of these trading partners, or allies of these great powers and trading partners that are caught in the crossfire. So meaning the US also said to the Netherlands, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, you also decouple. Only them doing this would not have a large impact. Other countries also have to decouple from the Chinese. Any doubts? All right. Write down the next point. Gregory Allen, G-R-E-G-O-R-Y, Gregory Allen, A-L-L-E-N, in the Time magazine, has argued that the biggest advantage of the US is its allies. That allow it to win the technology war. So Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And it goes back into the realist argument of co-opting. So what does Kenneth Waltz say? How do you maintain hegemony? So the defense realist would argue that whenever a hegemon would try to price, the other countries would feel threatened and they would get together so as to stop the hegemon from pricing. That is what happened with Nazi Germany. When Nazi Germany was trying to rise, UK, France, the US, which did not get along with each other, especially the US and the Soviet Union, but all of them came together to stop the rise of Nazi Germany. And later on, as soon as Nazi Germany was out of the picture, the US and the Soviet Union went back to their conflict. And in this case, the US has been able to co-opt its allies so as to maintain its hegemony. Hegemony in what? Technology or the global order. Yes, so, but that is why he's saying that's the biggest advantage. The US biggest advantage is that it has the support of other countries that are also leaders in semiconductors. Like 90% is just 3 countries, the US, Japan, and Netherlands. Let's say if the US is the only one that is taking export restrictions, but not Japan and Netherlands, China would still be able to win this war. China can undertake divide and rule, divide the Americans and its allies, and China would still be able to win this war. The only reason the export controls are working because all of them have done it. If only one company had done it or one country would have done this, the US would not have been able to win this war. So its biggest advantage is its allies. Why? Because the American has been able to co-opt all of them for its maintaining of its hegemony. It goes back into the core realist argument. How is a hegemon able to maintain its hegemony? How is a superpower able to maintain its hegemony? Co-opting. Right. Write down. Separate paragraph. The fear in China is that of the middle technology trap. Middle technology trap. Fear in China is of the middle technology trap. Whereby China would be at the downstream, of the global value chain. Downstream of the global value chain. Global value chain. What this basically does is when you are trapped in a middle technology, or in this case, the middle technology trap, you would also be stuck in the middle income trap. Because you would become richer if you're on the top of the supply chain and not at the downstream of those supply chains. Secondly, then the Chinese would never be able to maintain or actually become a superpower, compete with the Americans in terms of global hegemony. Why? Because they don't have the technology. Because they won't have the technology, they won't have the economic strength and the military strength. And therefore, the Americans would win this war. Any doubts on this? So they don't want to get stuck in this middle technology trap. They would then get stuck in the middle income trap. They get stuck there. They would neither be able to gain their hard power, whether in economic terms or military terms, and never then be able to compete with the Americans. Any doubts on this? Write down the next one. Hyper-globalist perceive hyper-globalist perceive hyper-globalist perceive the US-China technology war, the US-China technology war as a zero-sum game, as a zero-sum game, as a zero-sum game, as a zero-sum game, which would neither benefit the US or China, which would neither benefit the US or China. US or China. So the hyper-globalists would argue that allow for free market economics to function, allow for globalization to occur freely. So this technology war, where they're putting export controls, banning, putting restrictions, that is basically, or this decoupling, that is basically removing the complex interdependence of globalization. It is not allowing globalization to work freely. So this zero-sum game that both the countries are playing, it is neither going to benefit the US. Why? Because then its products will not be cheap. And it is not going to benefit the Chinese. Why? Because they would not become the global leader in terms of semiconductor or compete with the Americans and others in terms of semiconductors. So neither of them are going to benefit from this. Any doubts? Both of them are losing. The idea is you put those restrictions as a part of the zero-sum game. So I'll put restrictions on China, I'll gain everything. And so is the thinking in the Chinese. But the hyper-globalists would say none of you are going to win in this, because you won't get the cheap labor and the cheaper prices, and the other is not going to become the leader. Write down. Just write down. Decoupling in the same paragraph. Decoupling is an overreaction. Decoupling is an overreaction to the security dilemma. Is an overreaction to the security dilemma. Overreaction to security dilemma. To security dilemma. Security dilemma, all of you understand already. Write down. The primary winner of the US-China, tech war have been Malaysia and Vietnam. As they have been the biggest beneficiary of decoupling, and shift of industries or factories. So India wanted to become this, right? Benefit from this decoupling. It did not happen. Most of these companies have actually shifted to Malaysia, actually, which has become one of the largest beneficiary of this decoupling, and the others being to Vietnam. Why did not most of them shift to India? So there's one argument that has been given by infrastructure problems. But that is actually not the primary reason, because if you look at it from IR perspective, theoretical perspective, the argument was that China became the leader. They were able to reverse engineer. They were able to then compete with all of these industries. India is also like that, which I've said before. The IT companies came for call centers in India. And now the biggest headquarters of Google is in Hyderabad. So India can also become the leader in semiconductors and compete with all of these countries. And that became one of the primary reasons they shifted to Malaysia and Vietnam, where the perception is that these countries would not be able to compete with the Americans. They would always remain downstream in the global value chain, while India and China can become the leader. So India is a leader in services sector, while the Chinese are in manufacturing. Any doubts? Right on. Liberal institutionalists argue that absolute gains absolute gains can be achieved. Absolute gains can be achieved through complex interdependence, through complex interdependence, through complex interdependence in the technology relationship, complex interdependence in the technology relationship, technology relationship. And it should not be seen and should not be seen through the realist prism, not be seen through the realist prism of relative gains, of relative gains, of relative gains, of relative gains, relative gains. Mohammed, that it's not about that it would lead to deglobalization. It's just that globalization is now going to pick and choose. Where the nation states, so the hyperglobalists would say that the nation states are declining. But that is not the case. It's just that now globalization has shifted from China to Vietnam and Malaysia. Not because that is what the markets wanted, but because that is what the nation states wanted. So this would then be much more in sync with the arguments given by skeptics of globalization or transformationalists of in the globalization field. Is it clear? Ishwar, you had a question.
Yeah, sir. It was like these companies were private entities, right? So
Uh-huh.
US has doesn't have like entire control over the private entities. So how come they decide what countries do as such?
Say it again. Like who?
I mean, the industries are private in nature.
To an
So,
extent, they're still American companies.
but the same thing can like what Jai Shankar argues that we are like the private companies purchase the oil, but it's not the India which directly buys it. So if we come to that argument, then we can say like how is US controlling them?
That's the diplomat's answer.
Okay.
Today, if the government says to any of these companies not to buy Russian oil, none of them would buy Russian oil. Because in 2018, 2019, when Donald Trump said that we're going to put sanctions on you if you continue to buy Iranian oil, the government ensured that none of these companies buy Iranian oil. So Iran went from being in the top 2 to not even being in the top 15 after that. So even in America, they do have a lot greater freedom in all of this. But yes, if the American government says, they have to undertake. Because even in terms of when we talk about IR, the nation states still remain the primary actor. We've not gone for hyperglobalization. Hyperglobalization doesn't, or what the hyperglobalists want, the decline of the nation state or the diminishing of the nation state, that has not happened. So the Americans can dictate in all of this on how it is going to function. Like India also banned Huawei, no? Let Airtel Jio try to buy Huawei. Would they be able to bypass what the Indian government has said? Same thing is with the Chinese, the Americans. They can try to bypass, but then fight out the legal battle in courts against the American government and all of this. Any thoughts on this? And anyways, what the American government has done is for the protection of these companies. It is for maintaining the supremacy of Intel. It is maintaining the supremacy of all of these American companies that are making semiconductors. Because America as a whole would lose. But why does America lose? Because the American companies are losing. It is the American companies that have built this technological supremacy. It is the money that they earn that the Americans have hegemony. Any doubts on this? All right, right on. This part you get, no? Go for absolute gains and not relative gains. Write down the next point. The US is undertaking weaponized interdependence, is undertaking weaponized interdependence. weaponized interdependence. Is undertaking weaponized interdependence. Is undertaking weaponized interdependence. In brackets, write down what it means. It means the leveraging. It means the leveraging of economic ties. It means the leveraging of economic ties to influence behavior. To influence behavior. Influence behavior. Influence behavior. So I'll give you an example. The complete world uses the SWIFT system. It's been in the news because of the Russia conflict. So what did the Americans and the Europeans do? Kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. So it becomes a difficulty in interbanking transactions. Let's say you're trying to send monies from PNB to a Russian bank. They use the SWIFT system. Now the Russians can't. And either they create their own, which they have not been able to, or they do what the Americans say. It is a form of weaponized interdependence because the Americans are aware that the world is dependent on them in terms of technology, in terms of economy. They use that dependence to get what they desire, to make sure that their influence is, well, weaponized. And this is they have done with relation to the Russians, kick them out of SWIFT so that the Russians don't undertake the, what do you call this? The Ukrainian war. Similarly, put sanctions, restrictions on the Chinese so that they've done this with India also. When India was importing uranium for Tarapur, so this was before our first Pokhran test, we were importing uranium for Tarapur from Canada. And India undertook its first nuclear test, or you can say Pokhran 1. And then Canada, because of American pressure, stopped exporting us uranium. And that is weaponized interdependence. What would have happened in that situation? India would not have enriched uranium. India would not have been able to build nuclear weapons. So you're trying to use your economic interdependence to influence other countries. And this is what the Americans have done in relation to China also, that they have weaponized their interdependence. Any thoughts on this? Write down. Any doubts? Write down the next point. John Mearsheimer has criticized the post-Cold War engagement, has criticized the post-Cold War engagement as a strategic blunder. So for him, the complex interdependence that was built, it was a strategic blunder. It was a strategic blunder. Why? Because it allowed the Chinese to grow. You now really can't use weaponized interdependence so as to control the Chinese behavior. And John Mearsheimer is an offensive realist. For him, you have to maintain power maximization. And by undertaking complex interdependence, you went for security maximization and not power maximization. And therefore, he considered this to be a strategic blunder. Any doubts on this? Write down in the same paragraph. The US, same paragraph. The US is undertaking the tech war. The US is undertaking the tech war to maintain its hegemony, 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 which is done by safeguarding its leadership, 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 weakening China's industrial military complex, weakening China's industrial military complex, weakening China's military industrial complex, and co-opting the allies, and co-opting the allies against China, and co-opting the allies against China, co-opting the allies against China, co-opting the allies against China, co-opting the allies against China. So these are the three things they have to do. Maintain your leadership. And it's not just about that you have to be good. You have to also make sure that the other is weak. So make sure that the Chinese are also weak. Go for power maximization. You're only powerful as long as the other is also weak. And the third thing would be co-opt. And this is what John Mersheimer, offensive realists, have argued. How does the hegemon remain a hegemon? By co-opting. It has to ensure that the other powers like Netherlands, Japan do not see the Americans themselves as a threat. So co-opt those allies in ensuring and maintaining your hegemony, India being one of them. But don't write that in UPSC. Any doubts? Yes, Mohit?
Sir, why is Mersheimer saying that post-Cold War was strategic blunder? Because
Complex
post-globalization, because of Chinese cheap
No.
production, even the US companies benefited.
What did the Americans do after the Cold War? Which doctrine?
WTO, Clinton doctrine.
Clinton doctrine. They went for trade pactomania. They made China as member of WTO in 97. They opened up their economy. They undertook globalization, shifted a large number of factories or outsourced a large number of factories from the US to China. This is what Dr. Jaishankar and others have also said, that the Americans were responsible for creating of China as the rising power. Why? Because you're the one that outsourced most of the factories to China, allowed them to become a leader in all of these sectors. So that is what he's trying to criticize. Once you became the hegemon after the Cold War, you did not undertake the maintenance of that hegemony. So you maintained your leadership, you still co-opted the allies, but you missed the third thing, which is to make sure that your adversaries also remain weak. They don't become a challenge to your, what do you call this? Hegemony itself. Yeah, so it was short-term thinking. It was short-term thinking. You can maintain stability through complex interdependence. You can maintain stability through balance of power. You can maintain stability through hegemony. But it depends on which theory then you pick to get to that answer. I've said this when we did the first class. Theory ensures that you get to the truth, multiple truths. Any doubts? Right on. Next point. The conflict theory. No, Mohammed, that is not deterrence by denying. Well, you can try to make this also, but not everything fits into that argument. Because you're moving into a stage that is little higher than UPSC. You're moving into masters and Ph.D. level in certain questions. Is co-opting deterrence by denial? The point is, I've taught you deterrence in what, 2 classes? Even at BA level, it's 6 months. It takes a lot more time because you need to get a lot more understanding of this. What you have done is understand for UPSC. It doesn't make you I've said this before, it would not make you a scholar in those fields because you need a much bigger, larger understanding of the literature that is available on these topics. It's complicated. There's no yes or no answer because then I have to explain few more things. to explain the complexity of those questions. But right now, the conflict theory believes that the society is in competition for limited resources, is in competition for limited resources. And therefore, the US-China tech war, is a conflict over the resource that is technology, So technology in itself is a limited resource. Because after the post-internet age, technology is what makes you a hegemon, because different ages have different factors that led to who would become the hegemon. So in the post-internet age, technology in itself is a huge aspect of this. Because if you look at history, how long did it take to go from car to airplane? When was the first car invented? The world has seen great massive technological scales that is diminishing. If you look at the time that it took from going from a wagon to a motorized car, thousands of years. From a motorized car to an airplane, about a century. From an airplane to a spacecraft, 70 years. And from spacecraft to, well, whatever comes next. So everything is reducing in the time scales of technology. This is what the globalization also talks about, which is the time scale compression. So time is compressing. So technology is improving at a huge scale. You look at our generation itself, the way that we grew up and the technology that we have now, there is a huge sea change in terms of technology. And that is also changing rapidly. So in terms of the current time period, technology is the limited resource. So whoever controls technology controls hard power and therefore has the ability to become the hegemon. Any doubts on this? Like you look at what Israel was able to do. The pager thing, right? It's a tech war. Look at what the cookies have been doing from the drone wars, which is Indian armed forces are finding difficult to control because of the dilution of technology to non-state actors. So technology is a huge game changer. This is what Dr. Jaishankar said, decades. Technology would be a long-term determinant of Indian foreign policy. Any doubts? UPSC preparation has massively changed because of technology. Massively changed in terms of tech itself. Like your papers are now being checked by AI, right? The papers that you're now giving for the RAU'S test series, they're being checked by artificial intelligence. Right on the next point. The Chinese hawks, HAWKS, Chinese hawks in the US, Chinese hawks in the US consider the new Cold War, consider the new Cold War as a reflection of the old Cold War, So remember I talked about George Kennan, I think in one of the previous classes. So he wrote what is known as the famous X telegram. Long back it's been asked in UPSC, I think 2003 or something like this. And at that time, after the end of the Second World War, the presumption in the US was that they would become friendly to the Soviet Union. Why? Because they fought together in the Second World War. They would not see them as enemy, go for liberal institutionalism of Woodrow Wilson and other things. So at that time, George Kennan, he wrote a telegram, which is known as the X telegram. Why? He signed it as X. He's known as one of the larger realist thinker, much bigger than Morgenthau and others. But the point is, he's very, beyond academics, very few people are aware of him. He's more like Kotalyo, in the sense that he was a practitioner. He was a diplomat that was posted in the Soviet Union. And he said that the Soviet Union do not see the US in a positive light. They want to overtake Europe. They want to spread communism. They do not believe in liberal free market economics or liberal democracy. And therefore, he gave one thing that the US should do, which became the US policy, which is containment. Because he is the one, as a diplomat, that told the US that undertake containment of the Soviet Union. The Americans agreed to it. That is a huge reason why the containment policy, or what is known as security pactomania, started within the US. So the Chinese hawks, you understand the word hawks and doves. Hawks basically means that people who have a very adversarial view of a country. So if I would say that this person is a Pakistani hawk in India, it means that he doesn't view Pakistan positively. He wants India to take very strong actions against Pakistan. But if I would say that this person is a Pakistani dove in India, it means he looks Pakistan in a friendly manner. He wants to undertake friendly relations with Pakistan. So the Chinese hawks in the US say that the new Cold War is between the US and China, is same as the old Cold War, where the US has to undertake the containment of China. In the same way that the Soviet Union saw themselves as expansionist, overtaking the world, making the world communist, that is what the Chinese want. This is what we have talked about yesterday, all under heaven. The unipolarity and the belief within China's cultural values. This is what Dr. Jaishankar says in terms of Chinese unique characteristics. And therefore, what the Americans want, or the hawks within the Americans want, is the containment of China. So for them, the technology war is correct. This is the action that the Americans should have undertaken. Right now, George Kennan, in the same paragraph, George Kennan, George, George Kennan, 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 in the X long telegram, argued for containment and not appeasement, argued for containment and not appeasement, containment and not appeasement of China, of the Soviet Union, for containment and not appeasement of the Soviet Union. This is the same policy. This is the same policy that the US, should undertake today. This is the same policy that the US undertake today. Undertake today. Undertake today. So basically, do not appease the Chinese, contain the Chinese. And this is a thinking that has changed in India also. Let us not appease the Pakistani, let us not go for appeasement of the Chinese. Ensure realistic viewpoint, which is to contain Pakistan and which is to contain China. Any doubts? Write down. The next point. I think you've written a lot of theories. Write all of them depending on how the question is framed. You can use any of them. The power transition theory. The power transition theory. The power transition theory has argued that the rising power seeks fundamental change. Rising power seeks fundamental change in the existing world order. Fundamental change in the existing world order against the dominant hegemon.
Sir, can you please repeat?
The power transition theory assumes that the rising power seeks fundamental change against the dominant hegemon. This in itself would lead to a conflict. Between the US and China. Between the US as the rising power and, China as the rising power and US as the dominant power. China, in the same paragraph, China is a dissatisfied power. That considers that the US-led global order is biased against China. Is biased against China. Is biased against China and seeks for change. Seeks for change. In the same paragraph, as per the Thucydides trap. So here you can link the power transition theory to Thucydides trap. The basic idea is all of these actions that the US is undertaking is basically suffocating the Chinese. They're feeling that the complete world order is biasing us. So there's a famous saying, a villager or some person, a villager rejected by its village would burn down the complete village to feel its warmth. Meaning, if in a village you alienate somebody, exclude somebody, what are they going to do? They're going to change the system because they believe that the system is biased against them, because the system is against them. So they burn the complete village to feel its warmth. So what do you do in this? So John Ickenberry, he has given what is known as the institutionalist theory. I can make you write this, but you've written far too many theories. So John Ickenberry, he gave them what is known as the institutionalist theory, and he ends up saying that in this particular situation, in relation to power transition and Thucydides trap, if there is a power that is feeling dissatisfied, satisfy it. Maintain your hegemony, but satisfy it. So how would India be satisfied? You give us permanent seat, you allow us for prosperity, India by and large would be satisfied. But all of these actions that the US is undertaking, it is creating dissatisfaction in the Chinese. It is, and the Chinese, therefore, are going to completely then overhaul the system because the system is not in its favor. And right now they have the power to change the system. Because some countries like Iran and others can also feel dissatisfied, but they don't have the capacity to overhaul the system. But China does. And this goes back to what John Mersheimer said. There was a mistake to undertake engagement after the Cold War, because you're the one that strengthened China to become a competition. Any doubts on this? But I can leave institutionalists because you've already written a lot of the theories. But this would be a response to this Thucydides trap and power transition. The John Ikenberry would say in the institutionalist theory to satisfy the dissatisfied power. Any doubts? Yes, Mohit?
Sir, so basically, Thucydides trap is not inevitable.
No, it's not inevitable. I think there's a study, forgetting the name of the study. It's in the video that I made on Thucydides trap. It's on YouTube. They basically said that there have been 15 power transitions where there was a rising power and there was a dominant power. So throughout history, or known history, there have been 15 times which had happened. Only 11 out of 15 times it led to a war. The word only seems like, oh, it's not enough, but there have been at least 4 times where it has not been a war. It has been a peaceful transfer of power. So when the British hegemony ended and the American hegemony started, it was peaceful. There was no conflict between the British and the Americans on this. But as far as the US and Chinese are concerned, conflict is more likely. Why? Because China is extremely dissatisfied with the system. So it is making alliances with other dissatisfied powers, like the Russians, the Iranians. Any doubts? And US is trying to co-opt India by satisfying us. Prosperity, permanent seat, respect, honor. Well, give us some honor, like strong democracy, like wordplays. But it has to, then cultural change also has to be there. But this is what we talked about yesterday in terms of what Shiv Shankar Menon has said. Because both of us are ancient civilizations. And the Chinese need to see it as an equal partner and not as a subsidiary. Something that would be there as a periphery in a Chinese-led global order. You need to see us as a equal. So in the mindset of the Chinese also has to change in this regard. Any doubts? No doubts. So these are all the theories in relation to US-China tech war. Depending on how the question is framed, use them accordingly. No doubts? All right, just write down one last one then. Not a theory, but a view. Write down. Chris Miller, Chris Miller, Chris Miller, in the same one. It's a view, particular view. Chris Miller in the chip war. Chris Miller in the chip war. So chip war is a book. Just search for the year online. What is the year for this book? Chris Miller in the chip war argues that the primary focus of the chip war is the dominance over artificial intelligence. Dominance over artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies that utilize semiconductors or semiconductor chips. Semiconductor chips. So this is one point you can also write.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Just 1 second, Reena. What was your doubt? The line before that you have written, that is the past. Yeah. Yes, Prerna?
So power transition theory is the one in which there is a rising power and then there is a dominant. No, so if there is a dominant power, then there will be a rising power.
It's not necessary that just because there is a dominant power, there would be a rising power. The presumption is in power transition or Thucydides trap, there is a dominant power and there is a rising power. Like
Both are present.
both are present. So when you talk about post-Cold War from 1991 till by and large 2008, unipolarity. China was not, it was rising, but not enough as a competition. Any thoughts? Or then write down the last subheading. India. 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 So write down Lieutenant Colonel Akshat Upadhyay, Lieutenant Colonel Akshat 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 Upadhyay, UPA DHYAY. So he works in IDSA and he's written a book on this semiconductors and all. Akshat Upadhyay. Highlights AKSHAT UPA DHYAY. Akshat Upadhyay. Highlights that the Indian government has rightly undertaken for India to be a chip maker rather than a chip taker. Chip maker rather than chip taker. The government of India has introduced India Semiconductor Mission, India Semiconductor Mission, ISM, India Semiconductor Mission, ISM, comma, Semiconductor Fab Ecosystem Program, comma, Semiconductor Fab, FAB. Fab meaning fabrication. Semiconductor Fab Ecosystem Program, comma, Modified Semicon India Program, Modified Semicon India Program, and other incentives under Make in India and other incentives under Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat. Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat. So Atmanirbhar Bharat. So only write the programs within PSIR, but for prelims, do understand what those programs are, because all of them have been launched in the past 2 years. So they can be asked in prelims examination. Write down. India has also signed agreements. India has also signed agreements to become a partner in the global value chain, with the US under ICET, and with UK EU, and Japan. With UK, EU, and Japan. UK, EU, and Japan. So we've signed various MOUs or agreements with all of these countries so that some part of the semiconductor supply chain can be shifted to India. Right on? India, therefore, seeks to benefit. India, therefore, seeks to benefit from decoupling. India seeks to benefit from decoupling and China plus one model. From decoupling and China plus one model. Decoupling and China plus one model. China plus one model. Right, one more. Further, India has launched Semiconductor Supply Chain Initiative, or India has become, part, not launched, part. India has become part of Semiconductor Supply Chain Initiative of Quad. Semiconductor Supply Chain Initiative of Quad. Semiconductor Supply Chain Initiative of Quad and SCRI, Semiconductor Supply Chain Resilience, SCRI, Resilience Initiative of Japan, Australia, and India. Japan, Australia, and India. Japan, Australia, and India. So these two initiatives, SCRI we've already talked about. Right now. Chris Miller. He's the same person who wrote that book, Chip War, but this is not from the book. He has said this separately. Chris Miller has argued that India needs to find, a niche, N-I-C-H-E. India needs to find a niche, N-I-C-H-E, niche for itself in the global value chain, in semiconductors, global value chain in semiconductors. Right on, Dr. Jaishankar has argued for optimizing globalization, optimizing globalization with resilience in supply chain, It is a significant feature of decades. Decades meaning technology plus decades. Significant feature of decades. In the same line, Prime Minister Modi in the G20 summit, has argued that resilience of supply chain in a post-pandemic global order. That is all in relation to the US-China technology. Any doubts on this? So we've talked about the steps taken by the US and China, the various theories and thinkers you can bring in here. And lastly, India. You have written a lot more in comparison to what the word limit would be on these type of questions. For any doubts? Okay. Depending on how the question is framed, you have to use them accordingly. I'll give you an example. We'll talk about the Chinese questions tomorrow, both the JS and the PSI one, but we'll talk about the US versus China questions that have been asked in PSI.